Inside Texas Politics, 3rd edition by Brandon Rottinghause, Chapter 13, Budget, Finances, and Politics, or Policy. Flush with cash from sales tax revenues and profits from natural resources tax, Texas passed a $250 million budget for the 2020-2021 session. Excuse me. The largest in the state's history. This 15% increase from the prior budget came after ranting and raving about state spending and amidst fights about where to pump or slice the budget. 2 teenage Girl Scouts from Plano lobbied the legislators to exempt tampons and other feminine hygiene products from the sales tax to make them affordable to low-income women. The Comptroller's office reported that eliminating this tax could cost up to $14 million in lost revenue over the 2-year budget. Opponents also feared such measure would open a Pandora's box for other Texans to demand other exceptions. The Girl Scouts bill denied in committee. The Texas legislature decided instead to cap sales tax on yachts. Yacht sales in Texas were down since Florida capped its sales tax at $18,000, and legislators argued that Texas needed to compete to keep this business in the Lone Star State. Should yacht buyers be given a tax break? If light bulbs, Texas flags, and other items are tax exempt, how can the legislator justify taxing inessential items like tampons? This is why budget matters. They determine the scope of taxes Texans pay and shape public policy. The battle over the budget is a war over policy priorities. The state legislators can pass any bill it wants, but if the bill doesn't get signed by the governor or does not get funded, then the executive branch has no way to carry it out. According to journalists Gregory Curtis and Paul Burka, the art of crafting a budget lies in plucking the goose so as to get the most feathers with the least hissing. In this chapter, we examine the nuts and bolts of state finance to uncover the political struggle involved with who, what, and how to tax, and how to spend the revenue collected from taxes and other sources. The confrontation on these issues divide along familiar battlefronts: partisanship, geography, and economic interest. 13.1 Taxes and other revenue sources. Nobody likes paying taxes, especially Texans, yet taxes are essential because they provide the most of the funds the state and local governments use to operate. The state's revenue is primarily tax funded, approximately 46% in 2019. Although other funds are drawn from fees levied on the public proceeds, the state lottery, and, as we saw in Chapter 3, receipts from the federal government. Texas has hundreds of types of taxes, including unusual ones like a use tax for moving a boat from another state and using it in Texas. Unlike many other states, however, Texas does not have an income tax. As a result, Texas is primarily a 2-tax state. See Figure 13.1. Property taxes and sales taxes. Property taxes are assessed locally and stay local for use by school boards, counties, and cities. Sales tax are sent to the state government for use in the state budget, although cities are allowed to assess and keep additional sales tax revenue. These 2 major taxes, along with other assorted taxes and fees, form the state's tax base. Sales tax. Since 1967, the sales tax has served as the state's largest single source of tax income, 58% of all taxes collected. The state sets the base rate at 6.25%, and local governments can add up to 2% to this. and most do. The extra 2% rate is generally shared across several cities, county, and transit authority. The base funds are collected for use by the state, while the extra sales tax funds are returned to cities by the comptroller for city projects and programs. Some cities impose other dedicated sales tax for specific purposes, such as mass transit, economic development, or new sports venues. Every local taxing jurisdiction with local sales tax also has a local use tax. When a state use tax is levied on a taxable item, the local use tax is also due. For instance, when you buy an item online, the local use tax is due based on the ship to address. Consumers pay most of these sales taxes, 58%, while businesses pay the balance, 42%. The sales tax is a regressive tax. That is, the tax rate is the same for everyone. This tax gobbles up a larger percentage of income of the poor and working class than it does of the wealthiest Texans' income. Let's say you make $10,000 and spend $3 on the sales tax at the grocery store. That $3 is going to be a larger portion of your total income, $10,000, than if you make $100,000. As a result, the poor and working class residents pay an average 12% of their income in sales tax, while the wealthiest pay just 3%. Texas relies more heavily on this regressive tax than most other states. See Figure 13.2. Another downside to the sales tax is that the collections fall when the economy takes a downturn. Falling oil prices reduced collections by 5% in 1983. The economic slide in the wake of the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, reduced collections by 2%. The national recession in 2009 dropped receipts by 3%. The economic impact of COVID-19 saw a 5% decrease in sales tax. Property tax. The battle over the property tax is older than the Texas dirt. Going back to the days when the Mexican government's decision to eliminate property tax exemptions previously used to attract Anglo settlers sparked the Texas Revolution. From the period of the Civil War to the Great Depression, properties were undervalued and tax collection was sporadic due to the corruption among local tax collectors and inaccurate record keeping. Even so, property taxes in the past supplied between 50 and 75% of the tax revenue. Property taxes, called ad valorem, meaning according to value, is assessed based on the value of the property the taxpayer owns. Although Texas outlawed state-based property taxes in 1982, local government used property tax revenue to fund schools, utility systems, fire and police protection, public libraries, parks, and other services. Most of the revenue from the property taxes supports public schools, and the state kicks in the rest. Property tax revenue is called locally for the most part, stays local. Property tax burdens are high today, primarily because Texas has no statewide income tax. That could be shared with local governments, which consequently use the property tax revenue for projects and services. The largest jump in the source of the revenue collected from taxpayers has been in the collection of property taxes, which increased from $15 billion in 1994 to $59.3 billion in 2019. Why a growing economy pushes up property values and the proliferation of special purpose districts means more entities are allowed to tax residents. See Chapter 12. The state constitution provides a Homestead Exemption. a portion of the property value on which Texans don't have to pay taxes. Every Texan homeowner receives an exemption of $25,000 on their homes. Districts provide a $10,000 exemption for those over the age of 65 and for veterans. Local governments may also offer an additional exemption of $3,000 or more exemption for the disabled individuals. Think your property taxes are too high? Protest it. Local governments appraise or estimate the value of your property, whether it be a home, a commercial property, a ranch, or an oil refinery. Appraisal districts at the county level. If you want to pause for figure 13.2. Establish a review board that sets appraisal rates and hears property owners property owners' protests. The county tax assessor calculates the taxes, prepares the tax rolls, and generates bills. While the county tax collector facilitates payment, every county has a process whereby taxpayers can challenge a property estimate either online or in person. An appraiser will reassess and issue a new evaluation. Property value is at the heart of rising property taxes. In 2013, Philip Dominguez bought a less than 800 square foot run-down old house for $6,000 in Big Spring. In 2015, the county appraised the house at $25,000, a 316% jump in price that tripled the property tax. An economic downturn in rural Texas kept wages down but taxes high. If I could sell my home for what the property's valued at, said one Big Spring resident, I'd get the hell out of here. Across the state, low-income families and older Texans are worried about being taxed out of their homes. The Homestead Exemption highlights the often tense relationship between local authority and state oversight. The legislator can only raise the Homestead Exemption and set limits for property value appraisal, but it is required to appraise property. This is a politically frustrating for state representatives because efforts to reduce taxes require local counties to limit rising appraisals. In the past decade, housing evaluations have increased by 10% in some areas of Texas. In Grayson County in North Texas, for example, appraised value has shot up 57% since 2008. The state legislature took a big bite out of the local property taxpayers' bills by increasing the homestead exemption from $15,000 to the current $25,000. But rising evaluations at the local level meant that taxpayers saw only a small amount of cuts, between $125 and $150 on average. The cuts provided a windfall for homeowners in rural and South Texas, but only a mild relief to those with rapidly rising home values in suburban areas. When property values fall, however, local governments suffer economically. Local governments where the governor has declared a disaster area may request a reappraisal, although they are not required to do so. Hurricane Harvey sent property values for flooded or wind-destroyed houses spiraling down in the 60 counties affected, creating a $1.1 billion drop in property tax collections due to the damaged homes. Sorry about that. Franchise business taxes. The franchise tax, or margin tax, is the state's main business tax that flows to its coffers, amounting to about 6.6% of total tax receipts in 2019. This tax is the fourth largest source of state revenue. Corporations, partnerships, businesses, trusts, limited liability companies, and other businesses pay this tax, which amounts to 0.5% to 1% of their total revenue. Most small businesses and nonprofits are not subject to this tax. However, since the intent is to generate revenue from larger corporations, the legislator is constantly tinkering with this tax, often using the tax as a way to increase revenue so it can cut other taxes or balance budgets. In prosperous economic times, the state legislator often reduces the tax to keep Texas competitive. In 2015, the legislator cut the rate by a massive 25%. Governor Greg Abbott, who in his 2017 State of the State address had vowed that we must continue to cut the business franchise tax until it fits in a coffin, backed legislation to phase out the tax altogether by 2020, but the bill did not pass. Oil and natural gas taxes. Taxes on oil and natural gas, called severance taxes for the removal of oil from Texas land, can come in two forms: oil regulation, tax and oil production tax. Together, these taxes amounted to 6.1% of tax revenue and just over $3.3 billion in 2019, up to $1 billion in 2017. The state has kept the oil tax rate unchanged since 1951, a reflection of the friendly relationship between the oil and energy industries and Texas politicians. The amount of revenue Texas receives from severance taxes is connected to international events, technology, and natural occurrences. International events such as price spikes, threats from oil-rich countries, or increasing demand cause price fluctuations. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina devastated the industry's pipeline platform and other facilities, leading to the significant production losses and less tax revenue. The technological innovation of hydraulic fracturing or fracking, however, increased production greatly in western Texas, increasing tax intake for the state. Car taxes, motor fuel tax, gas tax, and motor vehicle taxes. The state imposes a gas tax on gasoline, diesel fuel, and liquefied gas. The more you drive, the more gas tax you pay. Currently, the state charges 20 cents per gallon. 5 cents go to the public education, and the rest goes to the road-related projects. The gas tax has remained unchanged since 1991, and the revenue it has generated has been flat since 2016, at about $3.6 billion. During this time, however, construction materials like pavement and labor costs have increased for building roads while cars are more fuel efficient. So Texans are buying less gas. Realistically, these taxes need to keep pace with the cost of building and maintaining roads. But as a former Republican state senator noted, nobody has the stomach to raise taxes. In fact, in 2014, after Republican State Senator John Corona pushed to allow local governments to increase the tax, he lost his seat. You also pay a motor vehicle tax when you buy a car, rent a car, or buy a manufactured mobile home. This amounted to about 6.6% in state revenue in 2019. Sin taxes. Sin taxes are imposed on the sale of alcohol and tobacco and some forms of gambling, and fees are imposed on sexually oriented businesses, charging $5 for patrons of live news shows. These taxes accounted for only 4.7% of total revenue in 2019. But they are also levied as a deterrent to what lawmakers consider harmful behavior. The tax is often factored into the cost of liquor, beer, or cigarettes. so customers are not always aware they are paying it. State lawmakers see the sin tax as politically easier to swallow than other forms of taxes, especially in tough budget times. Between 2008 and 2017, as states legalized sports betting and recreational marijuana, and as e-cigarette sales took off, state revenue from sin taxes grew as fast as state sales tax or income taxes. 13.2 Alternative sources of funds. Taxes are not the only sources of funds collected in Texas. Let's explore a few other ways the state's coffers are being filled. Fees and fines. Every time you turn around, you're paying a fee in Texas. The state has hundreds of fees: vehicle registration, state park admission, permission to sell fireworks, and even licensing fees for certain professions. The state also assesses fees for businesses such as air pollution control fees, oil and gas regulation and cleanup fees, and waste treatment inspection fees. The fees themselves are generally small, but they add up to a big revenue. In fiscal year 2019, fees collected amounted more than $6.4 billion, up from $4 billion in 1996, but down from $11 billion in 2017. Fees go to either the general revenue or to recoup the cost of a service provided by a program or agency. Fines also flow in the state's coffers. Fines that the Texans pay for violating certain traffic laws have climbed higher, especially for speeding, driving while intoxicated, DWI, or driving without a license. For instance, El Paso made $11 million each year between 2011 and 2014 on fines for traffic violations. Some Texans, however, just can't or won't pay of the $3.4 billion in fees that have been levied over the last decade. Less than half of that amount has been nearly collected. Nearly 1.3 million Texas drivers have an invalid driver's license due to spiraling penalties from past infractions. If these fees are not paid, the penalties get worse. In one publicized event, a 67-year-old woman paid nearly $25,000, spent 4 weeks in jail, and lost her driver's license because of a DWI in 2004. The city of Amarillo has jailed people, including the elderly and disabled, for not paying city fines. Bipartisan critics argue that this is unfair to poor Texans. The legislature passed legislation to allow judges to waive court filing fees for indigent Texans. However, this law currently only applies to a small fraction of Texans who opt to try their case in an open court rather than a plea bargain. The rainy day and other day funds. A small percentage of revenue is generated through several state funds. Ever sock away a little extra payday of cash for the future? Texas does. In 1988, after emerging from a major recession in 1983 that rocked the Texas economy, the state's voters approved the establishment of the Economic Stabilization Fund, almost always referred to as the Rainy Day Fund. The fund is drawn from oil and natural gas production tax revenue, leftover, surplus, unspent funds at the end of each year, and interest on the balance of the fund are also pooled back into the Rainy Day Fund. Texas funnels a greater percentage of per capita state expenditure into its Rainy Day Fund than any other state except for Wyoming and Alaska. Currently, the fund is flush with north of $14 billion. Hoarding the money in the Rainy Day Fund has become a badge of political honor, and spending funds from the sacred fund may provoke an outcry from budget-conscious primary voters. Many argue that the state has underfunded transportation and education in the name of fiscal conservationism, and should use these funds to better address the state's fast-growing needs. Legislators are reluctant to spend the money for fear of political retribution, but they are comfortable asking voters to approve changes to the distribution of funds. In 2019, voters approved a constitutional amendment diverting $800 million of the funds that would normally go to the rainy day to State Flood Infrastructure Fund for flood control and mitigation projects. Other state funds include the Texas Mobility Fund, the Property Tax Relief Fund, individual trust funds from past budget funds squirreled away, bond proceeds, interagency contracts, and certain revenue held in higher education accounts. Why no income tax? When Democrats floated the idea of establishing an income tax in 1993, Lieutenant Governor Bob Bullock declared that Texas would get an income tax when a Russian submarine sailed up to the Houston ship channel. The concept of an income tax runs against the grain of individualistic political culture that most Texans embrace. It is a progressive tax. The more a person earns, the more a person pays. Theoretically, a progressive tax takes a larger percentage of income from someone earning more money than from someone earning less money. So, from one perspective, income taxes punish those who make more money. Others argue that an income tax is fairer to low salary earners since they would pay a lower tax rate on the comparatively smaller salaries. This would make the tax proportional to an individual's ability to pay. Polling suggests that the public is almost uniformly against a state income tax. 94% oppose. Fiscal conservatives also argue that avoiding a state income tax maintains the state's economic edge. Texas, however, is one of only 7 states with no income tax. And income taxes do provide a more stable funding source than sales tax, particularly in sour economic times when consumers tighten their grip on their pocketbooks. Debates over taxes. The ongoing mission to set low taxes and provide modest services butts up against legal constitutional requirements for state financing of educational and persistent demands for governmental assistance on health care or social welfare programs, with sizable chunks of the population wanting to cut every type of tax, see figure 13.3. Deciding which tax to cut creates political problems. In 2019, Texas' Big Three, the governor, lieutenant governor, and speaker of the House, came together to hatch a completely unprecedented idea. Cap the rate of the property tax growth on other local property taxes that local governments could raise without an automatic rollback election. Penny-pinching local governments warn that this restriction could prevent cities from paying the first responders, filling potholes, or keeping recreation centers or libraries open. Some tax cuts have long-term budgetary effects that are not easily undone. For example, when Governor George W. Bush made good on his pledge to cut property taxes in 1999, the state eventually had to balance out the lost revenue by adding more items to the list of sales taxable goods and by raising taxes on cigarettes, alcohols, and utilities. Any reduction in revenue through a tax cut requires the legislator to make up the funds elsewhere, which, as we are about to see, it is not an easy task. Feel free to pause for figure 13.3. 13.3. The budget. Most state taxes, fees, and other revenue are first banked in general revenue funds that are channeled into the all funds budget, which also includes federal funding. Then the Texas legislature allocates that is divvies up. The funds, which is not an easy job, former Lieutenant Governor Bill Hobby famously stated the main business of the legislature is passing the budget. The rest is poetry. The budget process is complicated, constrained by limits on spending, and rife with conflicts between groups, parties, and branches of government. The budget cycle. Each session, lawmakers pass a budget that is implemented in the following 2 fiscal years. Before 1942, budgets were approved for programs and departments without regard to the state's total biennial budget, leading to the fiscal chaos. Today, budget rules structure the budget process, but budgeting for 2 years is a challenge since the economies may tank, programs may fail, state priorities may change, or revenue may fall. Budget limitations. Although candidates for the state legislature may make lofty promises of reducing property taxes or drawing additional funds for underfunded public schools, once elected, they are significantly constrained by the Texas Constitution and state laws. Pay as you go. Texas is constitutionally required to balance its budget. This is because Texas is a pay-as-you-go state, meaning the government cannot spend more money than it receives in revenue. The Texas Constitution also sets limits on debt, capping it at 5% of the general revenue funded. Welfare spending requiring that it cannot exceed 1% of the budget, and total spending, as the Texas Tribune Ross Ramsey puts it, the budget is a dog already dragging 4 leashes. The state comptroller must check the budget to make sure it meets these requirements. The spending cap. The most significant restraining rule is the spending cap, which restricts budget growth from the previous biennial budget to the estimated growth of the Texas economy. For the 2020-2021 budget, the Legislative Budget Board, the LBB, estimated the growth in the prior 2 years as 9.8%, giving legislators $102 billion to work with, about $10 billion more than in the 2018-2019 budget. Texas legislators can bust the cap by simple majority vote in both chambers, but the political repercussions in a state that values small, efficient government are so high that this has only happened once. In 2016, in order to lower property taxes in school districts that had reached record highs. Dedicated and non-dedicated revenue. Legislators are further limited because they do not have discretion over all state expenditures. Almost 1/3 of the funds in the state budget are dedicated revenue, linked to a specific purpose, either by constitution or by statute. For instance, revenue from hunting and fishing licenses is dedicated to conservation efforts, and a portion of marriage license fees is used to fund child abuse and neglect prevention programs. Legislators do have discretion over how to spend general revenue funds, which in 2020-2021 amounted to about 40% of state funds. See Table 13.1. Why is so much of the budget already fixed? Constitutional requirements such as public education and federal programs, including Medicaid, are the culprits. However, Texas receives federal funds that provide 33% of its budget for these programs. See Figure 13.4. Feel free to pause for Figure 13.4. Budget players and process. Texas uses a dual budgeting process in which the legislative branch and the executive branch coordinate to propose, shape, and pass a biennial budget. See Figure 13.5. Although most every other state requires the governor to submit a budget, Texans fear a strong executive has driven the state to distribute the important task of budget making across the two branches. In this section, we explore the stages of this process. Can we afford this? The state comptroller leads the parade by providing biennial revenue estimate, the BRE. At the beginning of each regular session, the BRE is used to make sure that the state does not spend more money than it takes in. In addition, all bills submitted later during the legislative session must include a fiscal note, an overview of the estimated financial impact if the bill passes. The LBB adopts a constitutional spending limit in this early phase. The comptroller independently but concurrently prepares a statement about the financial condition of the state that estimates the revenue the state is to have in the upcoming biennium. The comptroller also lets the legislator know if there is any unspent money in the piggy bank. Before the 2019 legislative session, the comptroller, Glenn Hagar, reminded the legislator that about $883 million from the 2016 to 2017 budget was unspent. What is our vision? Since 1949, the LBB has been the most influential and active player in the budget, working with the governor to prepare a mission statement, set goals, adopting a spending limit, craft an appropriate bill, and review agency strategic plans. This earlier budget proposal is not binding, but it does provide a starting point for negotiations. Conflicts frequently occur because of differences in opinion. However, in 1997, Governor George W. Bush announced that he wanted $1 billion of a $3 billion budget surplus to go to reducing local school taxes. And surprisingly, the LBB immediately threw up roadblocks. When the governor called the Speaker of the House, Pete Laney, and said, "I won't make that mistake again," Laney responded, "That's a good idea, Governor." Who has input? Executive branch agencies create a long-term strategic plans and make budget requests. The LBB routinely, in boom times or bust times, asks the state agencies to provide evidence to justify their expenditures and to propose methods of cutting their budgets. If the revenue estimates go sour and don't show as much funds as expected, the state then already has a plan in place to make cuts. If the estimates show the state has sufficient revenue, the cuts don't occur. In 2016, the LBB asked agencies to submit budget requests that would include a 10% reduction, or what one observer called an emergency warning signal test. Feel free to pause for Figure 13.5. How are requests evaluated? Because the state cannot spend more funds than it has, competition for budget menu items is fierce. The LBB submits appropriation bills to the House of Appropriation Committee and the Senate Finance Committee. Both chambers committees hold hearings, mark up legislation, and alter the budget bill with input from fellow legislators. The legislator often provides the governor with budget funds for their pet projects to smooth over any objections from the governor. According to one observer, the three big lies legislators often tell as they evaluate requests while writing up the package are, we're already cut to the bone, Senator. This program actually makes money for the state, and this is one of the most important things the state does. Because the process has multiple points of access in the phase, interest groups have significant influence. Lobbyists are not allowed on the floor of the Texas House or Senate, but electronic devices can allow lobbyists to communicate with legislators on the floor without physically being there. During one 12-hour budget debate later in the 2013 session, lawmakers were frantic to reconsider a vote that would have expanded the negotiating power of the state's chief health officer with the federal government on Medicaid. Why the sudden reversal? An email alert was sent from a conservative organization, apparently prompted a change of heart for many lawmakers worried about the political consequences. Can the package pass? After the conference committee hammers out differences between the House and Senate budget bills, both chambers vote in the final budget, and the governor signs it, vetoes it, or uses the line item veto authority to trim it. A clash of budget titans put partners at odds in 2015. The legislature combined several items, including new state buildings in San Antonio and Austin, into a single $1 billion line item for the Facilities Commission. Governor Abbott broke the precedent and vetoed the funds for a few of the projects, but not the full $1 billion line. Ursula Parks, the director of the LBB, wrote a letter of concern to Comptroller Glenn Hagar that the governor had misused the line item veto. Until the Texas Supreme Court weighs in on the matter, the governor's interpretation of his budget veto authority holds. Does the budget square with available funds? Is the sky falling in Texas? State Senator Royce West asked West Texas Comptroller Glenn Hagar in 2015, who had lowered his revenue projection by $2.6 billion because of slumping fossil fuel prices. The state comptroller reviews the budget to certify that the anticipated revenue will be sufficient to cover the appropriations. The comptroller is essentially the budget enforcer. This is usually a smooth process, but in 2003, for the first time in Texas history, Comptroller Carol Keaton Strayhorn informed state lawmakers that they were close but no cigar. The governor was forced to cap the well and use his veto powers to trim down the budget. In 2019, Texas experienced a boom in natural resources and in the economy, more generally driving up sales tax revenue, while the state also collected sales tax on internet purchases for the first time. As a result, the comptroller noted there was a whopping $518 million budget extra in general purpose spending available late in the 2020-2021 budget, crafting processes, setting an amicable tone for the session. How is the budget executed? The governor and the LBB typically have joint authority to execute the budget, to prohibit or allow a state agency to spend budget funds, to transfer budget funds, or to repurpose budget funds within an agency for a different purpose than that stated by the legislator. There are limitations on this authority. However, public hearings may be held on an issue, especially if the legislator objects to a decision. Elected officials' salaries cannot be reduced or eliminated, and funds appropriated by legislator for a specific purpose cannot be reduced or eliminated. Budget rules are also found in legislative riders, which are specific policy directives that convey instructions on how agency funds can be collected or spent. Riders express legislative intent to direct spending preferences and are carried over from budget to budget unless changed. For one lawmaker who represented the tiny town of Abbott, Texas, home of Willie Nelson, a rider for the exact position of an exit ramp sign off of I-35 was written into the state budget. Republican State Representative Jim Pitts argued that the sign needed to be there so that the road trippers would stop at the service station. It represented a significant source of sales tax revenue for this town of fewer than 400 people. The LBB and the governor may do battle at this point of the budget process as well. In 2014, Governor Rick Perry declared a state of emergency so that he could bypass the legislature to deploy the National Guard to the U.S.-Mexico border. As more than 50,000 unaccompanied minors, primarily from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, flooded across, the governor argued that the emergency situation justified tapping a budget rule that allowed him to use and earmarked funds without going to the legislator. The LBB dug in their heels, arguing that the move would set a bad precedent. Essentially, the governor could declare virtually at any event an emergency. The comptroller dove into the budget to find $38 million from another source to deploy the National Guard. Budget tricks. During the tense writing of the 2018-2019, then Speaker of the Texas House Joe Strauss noted, "There aren't any simple solutions when you've got a serious budget shortfall. But the legislator has certainly tried over the years using deferrals to delay payments and so make room for increased spending, a practice that many would describe as an accounting trick." One veteran journalist likened the strategy to those used by Texans who come up with a little short at bill paying time. Delay a payment by a day or two to get by without bouncing a check. One way is for the state comptroller to grant wiggle room to state budget writers by temporarily delaying payments from the last day of one budget to the first day of the next. A trick that set off verbal sparring. Described in the chapter opener, the state may also leave a hole in the budget with an IOU to pay it back in the next budget cycle, as they did for the state's Medicaid program in 2016 to 2017. Some groups, like conservative Texas taxpayers and research associations, claim this budget magic ends up costing the state double. Deferring $1 today ends up costing $2 tomorrow, since the state will have to pay itself back in the next budget and add pay for the same policy for the current year. Deferrals in recent budgets are like kicking the can down the road, choking off funds without regard for future fiscal needs. As a result, Texans had to pay itself back billions of dollars in the 2020-2021 state supplemental budget. Legislative support for remedying the risky overuse of deferrals has both Republicans and Democrats calling for faithful budgeting. The Insider View. Former Governor Rick Perry spelled out his philosophy on Texas budget and policy: low taxes, low regulation, tort reform, and don't spend all the money. This recipe has put the state in fiscal health, but the state's booming population, aging citizenry, exploding diversity, and battles over natural resources mean that the economic fitness doesn't reach all Texans. The skirmishes over the budget, taxes, and public policy often center on party politics, Republicans versus Democrats. But just as often, urban interests are pitted against rural interest and organized interest. Environmental health care are pitted against industry interests. The balance of power of any one group at any one time determines the type of policy and often policy change. These changes are usually gradual but shift as the state adapts to new circumstances. This is the end of chapter 13. Thank you.